Emancipation family, you're listening to the pro-black perspective on KWAZ radio. Today we're going to conclude this Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state by the misceganist Cheikh A. Diop. This is going to be an interview with Carlos Moore. I hope you enjoy my reading of it. I am Onitaset Kumat, and I'm the author of the Book of Power. So I may do a little bit of commentary in between just to give you some context, but it's only for your elucidation. So thank you for listening. If you're new to this channel, please like, subscribe, share. Also, please don't neglect to, if you want to support, don't neglect to patronize and review the Book of Power. It's a 500-page book that I think that you would really benefit from. If you're interested in federated states and creating a new path for Africa, then I'm certain that you'll love my literature. But until then, I want to read to you Black Africa. So this is the interview with Cheikh A. Diop by Carlos Moore. It's in the appendix, and it says, Professor Diop was persuaded to break a 15-year silence to speak to Africa and the world when he was convinced that Afroscope is a serious, highly serious-minded, and uncompromisingly African organ. Since the early 1960s, the African continent has shown itself to be coup-prone. How do you account for the growing political instability of African regimes? And Diop replied, I had foreseen in the South Americanization of the African continent, and in my work, this is the work, Black Africa, the Economic, I alluded to this phenomenon. Earlier in 1956, I also touched on the subject in an article, Presence Africaine, warning that unless we took care, the African continent upon independence would go down the road of South Americanization. No matter how much one may claim that history doesn't repeat itself, I have nonetheless been haunted by Simón Bolivar's failure to unite the South American continent in a single block. It's very important to realize, this is what I want people to understand, that none of the continents are united in a single block. Well, with the exception of Australia. So that's really something that should be accounted for. It can no longer be denied that Africa is the victim of South Americanization. That Africa is politically unstable is a fact. We can't even talk anymore about Balkanization since the Balkan regimes are stable, whereas in Africa we have a change of regime almost every week or every month, at any rate every year, and this instability is growing. In my opinion, what has been lacking are national leadership. Pay attention to this right here, okay? This is really... this is like what you want to screenshot. In fact, I'm going to do that. I'm going to screenshot this myself because there are certain passages that you have to be mindful of. This is what I emphasize in my literature. That is the importance of leadership, okay? So in my opinion, what has been lacking are national leadership, which could have set an example. Had this been the case, military overthrows would have been made much more difficult. At any rate, stability in Africa would have been much greater. Political selfishness is killing Africa. It's the basis of the problem. Once African interests become merely a pretext for individual selfishness, instability necessarily rears its head. When the only organized force in the country, the army, ceases to respect the civilians in power, it will seize power for itself. You know, Cheikh A. Diop is emphasizing how important leadership is. What constitutes good leadership? And Cheikh A. Diop, you know, is going to articulate that. So Afroscope asks, however, practically each time the army has seized power, it has perpetrated the same evils it's pretended to overthrow. In turn, there's still another coup, right? And Diop says, yes, this is true because the army has not, in the meanwhile, been educated along patriotic and political lines. What generally happens is the army wakes up one day and discovers that it is merely an instrument of civilians wielding power. Yet the army also knows that the survival of civilian rule depends on army backing. The contradiction is solved by a seizure of power. But when the army overthrows civilian rule, without having had any political formation, and when this very army is itself devoid of any profound ideals, the result of army rule cannot be any better than the civilian rule it overthrew. Today we are suffering in Africa from this. The people who won the coup, the people who led the armies, the people who did not have truly profound ideals or any sort of political formations, these are the people that are running the show. And though they may have overthrew certain piss poor civilians, they themselves are no better. The ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, is the latest regional attempt at regrouping in Black Africa. We have seen at least 4 other such attempts fail in the past, including the East African Community. Why have all these projects failed? What chances do you give ECOWAS? Once again, and I want to tell you this, the East African Community failed partly because of sabotage from another misceganist who we all respect, just like we respect Joe, Kwame Nkrumah. So the data, the information kind of reveals that Kwame Nkrumah, in so much as you'll probably see Cheikh on the Diop saying, hey, it's bound to fail. But it's one thing to say, it's one thing to understand that something may be, or it's one thing to pontificate that something is bound to fail, and it's a whole other thing to sabotage it. And I think that's what Nkrumah would be guilty of. But let's keep going. Once again, we're putting the cart before the horse. We want to create regional economic organizations from which member states can draw maximum benefit, yet we refuse to relinquish even an inch of our respective national sovereignties. There's a serious contradiction here. And again, that's why I want you to understand Julius Nyerere. Julius Nyerere unites Tanganyika, I think. I'm trying to remember. But anyway, Tanganyika, I think. Tanganyika and Zanzibar. He unites it to make Tanzania. Okay, so that's why you don't need to remember those old names, because they're old names. They're nobody uses it, like New Amsterdam and New York. Nobody says New Amsterdam. It doesn't matter how you pronounce New Amsterdam. It doesn't matter. The point being that was like the leadership of Zanzibar relinquished, gave an inch, relinquished their sovereignty, and created Tanzania along with Nyerere. That is the kind of Pan-African nationalism that we truly need to look into. That's the kind of Pan-African nationalism we truly need to look into, and that's the kind of Pan-African nationalism that I would share as an example. There's a necessity to associate yourself with the best of our heritage. That's what I offer in the Book of Power, the best of our heritage. Because technically we tend to not associate with the best, and then of course we end up in a situation where we don't necessarily do the best. There's a serious contradiction here. My opinion is that all regroupments are bound to fail. All such regroupments are bound to fail. In the past, each attempt at regional economic regroupment was short-lived. The reason they have failed and will continue to fail is simple. The links uniting the parties to all such regional agreements have never been irrevocably binding, nor have the terms of economic cooperation ever been indissoluble. Moreover, all such attempts at economic regional regroupments have lacked an important and indispensable counterpart, a supranational political umbrella in the sense of an executive organism able to take political decisions that are binding to all parties. Consequently, whenever and for whatever reason one of the parties to the agreement decides to withdraw, the regional grouping starts crumbling. In the absence of a supranational executive body with full powers which can prevent a state from pulling out of a regional grouping, what can prevent a state from pulling out of a regional grouping? In the absence of irrevocable commitments, quite naturally involving the partial loss of national sovereignty, what can prevent the party to a regional agreement from withdrawing on a mere whim? This is what is known as, you can't have, so the African proverb goes, for every joy there's a price to be paid. You want to inform yourself on African proverbs, because they are the basis for your knowledge base. Okay, even if you say to yourself, I don't want to read 400 or 500 pages, don't say that to yourself. But even if you were to be not, if you're not fully convinced, at least engage with the proverbs of our past, because there's so much wisdom in, for every joy there's a price to be paid. For the joy of economic prosperity, there's a price of a loss of natural sovereignty, of national sovereignty. You understand? However, if you do not have a price, then if there's no consequences, if there's no consequences from withdrawing, then if something doesn't look right for you in particular, you may withdraw and crumble the whole situation. And of course, you had the joy of having a lack of punishment, if you will, and that came at a cost of the whole situation for Africa failing. So we have to understand that there's a reciprocal nation. There's a reciprocal nature in this universe, in this cosmos. Everything is in a balance, and you have to understand that in this world everything is in a balance. All right, that there's no give. There's no. It's always a give and take. So to overcome the tremendous obstacles in the way of the economic unification of Africa, decisive political actions are required in the first place. Political unification is a prerequisite. The rational organization of African economies cannot precede the political organization of Africa. The elaboration of a rational formula of economic organization must come after the creation of a federal political entity. It is only within the framework of such a geopolitical entity that a rational economic development and cooperation can be inserted. The inverse leads to the type of results we have witnessed over the years. If, for example, and I'm actually going to take another screenshot, because I like to share knowledge with our people. It is a beautiful thing. I mean, this is what I'm doing all the time. All right, I share knowledge with our people, and I hope you do too. I hope you do too. If, for example, West Africans had the courage of creating a federal political executive, what word is this? Entity with full decision powers, and to which West African states would renounce a definite portion of their national sovereignty, then that would be another matter. Now, again, I want you to understand this too. This is not going to happen. The nations do not renounce their sovereignty without a huge impetus, and that impetus does not exist. Ooh, I'm skipping ahead, and look at that, Wilmot Blyden. I like Blyden, but let's go. Renounce a definite portion. So it's not going to happen. What we have to understand about, and this is one of the things that we have to get about our people. When we are practicing Pan-African nationalism, we have to go about with what is realistic. When Diop says, "Hey, I saw it didn't work for Bolivar," he should have said, "But you know what? I saw it worked for Nyerere, so let's do what Nyerere did." That's really what it comes down to. That when you have to get familiar with the examples of history to inform yourself, so that you do not repeat yourself or find yourself fighting an uphill battle that cannot be won. But let's keep writing. I hope you're enjoying. I love this. I like this. I like this. In that case, the federal executive body can be asked to draw up carefully studied plans for a rational organization of West African economies. The full powers attributed to such an executive body would allow it to take consequential decisions without fearing that the day after one or another head of state would announce, "I don't like what's happening, I'm leaving." It's a vicious cycle, and we must have the courage to face that fact. So how to break out of this vicious cycle? Well, in my opinion, the way out of the present deadlock is quite clear. The rational economic organization of the African continent, or any part of it, cannot precede a common political organization along regional or continental federal lines. The first step would be to politically organize a geographical entity, and then within the geographic space, proceed to a rational economic organization. The inverse is not possible. If this is what African heads of states have been trying to do from the very beginning. Why? Okay. Simply out of selfishness, out of personal and egoistic power interests, Where does Africa stand in all of this? Selfish African heads of states want to reduce continental and regional exigencies to their own personal and national egoisms. In other words, they latch onto power, have no intention of abandoning it, and they talk about creating regional economic interest. However, the defense of power interest is in direct opposition to the avowed wish for regional economic cooperation and unity. It just isn't true that Africa is uppermost in the minds of those heads of states. It is not in the interest of Africa to latch onto power and monopolize it to the extent of refusing to relinquish even a portion of it to supranational executive bodies so as to be able to arrive at an economic union. I'm going to take another screenshot. I'm going to take another screenshot. And for those of you, who don't like screenshots, hey, you know what? Come on. Love yourself. Love yourself. All right. No one wants to relinquish an iota of national power. That's why all previous regional associations have failed. There's a long list of these, and the list is getting even longer. My most sincere wish is that ECOWAS would reverse the trend, but I have no illusion about it. ECOWAS lacks the essential, the one element conditioning its success or failure. So Afroscope asks, it says, Wilmot Biden in the 1850s, Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, and Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s championed the project of a continental state of Africa. For 2 decades, you've championed the idea yourself. Why, in your opinion, has no African leader taken concrete and decisive steps towards its realization? Whether an African leader has or has not taken concrete steps toward the implementation of this goal, the fact remains that a continental federation is an urgently vital necessity for the totality of African people. In my opinion, it is the precondition of our collective survival. The more time goes by, the more it will be seen that we must either join in a continental federation or fall into a generalized and endemic state of anarchy. In fact, we have already arrived at that stage. So what other concrete instruments of federal control do you propose for a continental union? Now, I want to point this out because it said that he was 15 years silent. This is a man who, I tell you, he was frustrated. He was frustrated, okay? He was frustrated. You want the best for our continent, and it's not happening. It's not manifesting, and this is why it's so very important for you to focus on the best examples or the people who had success. You want the success and the victory stories, because you're going to, if you do not know these and you do not emulate these, you will follow the failure models, and the failure models will get you frustrated. Okay? The failure models will get you frustrated, and you will give up. Diop has resigned. Diop had resigned. Understand, your heart may be there, but you can't fight. You can't fight an uphill battle like this. And you could try, but it's best to associate yourself with the most intelligent opinions there are. Let's see, what other concrete instruments of federal control do you propose for a continental union? So the links between a federation of African states should be flexible enough to allow each one breathing space. Each national grouping must be left to enjoy the largest possible internal autonomy, but political and economic life must be rationalized from a federal perspective. A certain number of federal agencies must be created. Defense, external trade, and foreign affairs must definitely be unified. We need a modern continental army worthy of the name, capable of facing any eventuality, rather than our present armies, which are mere auxiliaries to the police force. In fact, our armies were not created with the intent of facing up to any external threat. Okay. But again, external threats can be, who you marry. But let's keep going. Whereas there would be administrative autonomy of each member state, the federal umbrella government would be fully in charge of such activities that go beyond the national prerogatives. For instance, in terms of defense, the armed forces would be on a continental basis. Individual states would have a territorial guard. Troops would be based in various African countries, whether Tanzania, Gabon, Algeria, or Libya, and officers would equally come from all regions of the continent. That is, officers and troops based in a state would not necessarily be indigenous to that particular country. Along the same lines, federal administrative cadres would be drawn from all areas of the continent and would serve wherever posted. Continental citizenship is a must. No African should need any more than an ID card for traveling to and from any part of the continent. So we already know what this looks like if we were to take America as a federation and the states of America to be like the nations of Africa, which, you know, which for is not as, like, it's not really as realistic, only because Africa is much larger. Well, yeah, much larger physically and population wise, but you know, like the idea that you would have a federal state, it's actually like it's so unrealistic. It's so unrealistic. Like a modern federal state in Africa, just out of the blue, is just really unrealistic. A federal African state would have to rationalize African economies on a continental basis. External trade would necessarily fall under the attribution of such a state. The general integration of African economies would allow for the global bargaining of all of Africa's commercial surplus of raw material at prices advantageous to us, besides providing a very important source of capital accumulation. The development of our countries, the accelerated formation of technological cadres, as well as the transferal of advanced technology become possible in this context through a rationalization of our commercial surplus on a continental basis. Naturally, whatever is indispensable to the internal functioning of national economies can be left in the hands of local governments after careful study. As you see, the viability of such a state is certain. In fact, it is the prerequisite for the survival of African people. It's the only way out of our countries. So he says a lot, but you see it doesn't happen. Not only does it not happen, but it's so unrealistic. It's so unrealistic. And this is one of the troubles with us as a people, that we tend to walk away from realism. We tend to walk away from realism, and because we walk away from realism, like again, you're not gonna benefit from that. There's nothing good from not being realistic. So that's why, you know. So I like this next question. The second word in this next question kind of hits the nail on the head. It says practical, right? So in practical terms, how in your opinion, does one go by creating such a state, right? So there you go. In practical terms. Now, hold on a moment. I just want to tell people in Discord that this is gonna be good. It's gonna be good. I'm telling people, check this one out. You know, and that's what you should be doing. You should be, you know, when you're listening to this stuff, you say, well, hold on a second. Let me pause this for a moment, and just text somebody and say, yo,Oni's doing something. You know. Hold on a second. I'm typing, y'all. I'm recording on the Discord. Check it out. Wait, I'm recording on the on YouTube. What up? That's what I'm saying, man. You gotta tell people. Like, that's what you should be doing. Hey, yo, listen to this. Okay? Alright, to begin with, the group of states could already band together in an open federation and actively incite the other states to join. You see what I'm saying? A group of states, that's what I'm saying, it's so unrealistic. To begin with, the group of states could already band together in an open federation and actively incite the other states to join. Hey guys, we're in a federation. We gave up our sovereignty, and now we're in a federation working together, and hey, if you wanna join, you know, come through Gambia, come through Rwanda, you know, give up your sovereignty, and let's be part of one single federation. Yeah, you know, yeah, let's just do that. Come on. I understand that this is more easily said than done, but a start has to be made somehow, somewhere. I see no other way for such a state than in 1, 2, or 3 states taking the initiative of surrendering a good part of their own national sovereignty and accepting to be the initial nucleus of an open federation. This demands courage, a lot of courage, political foresight, and above all, a deep, profound commitment to Africa as a historical, cultural, and political entity. You see what I'm saying? Like, all right, somebody asked me what am I recording. The interview. But like that's something that I really think that, you know, like that's what I mean. Like, what is this supposed to mean? You have 3 states just say, hey, we're gonna give up our sovereignty and we're gonna be a federation now. So anybody want to jump? Anyone to come? You know, you want to join? Anybody want to join? Like, come on. Like, this is the, so, you know, someone just asked me in the Discord. They said, what are you recording? I said, the interview at the end of the Federated States. So good, but naive. So I touch on the discussion today. Like, this is naivete. This is political naivete. And of course, like I said, Diop becomes discouraged. He becomes discouraged, but why does he become discouraged? Because he has this naivete that's being under-addressed. This is why you want to associate yourself with good literature. This is why you want to associate yourself with actual studies, because if you do not have these, you will have naivete. And with naivete, you're not going to advance that far. You're not going to get that much. Okay, you're not going to get that much. This is not happening. This is not going to happen. And if this is the best thing you could think of, and this is what he said. I think he says it's the best thing he could think of, right? He says, what it starts to mean is somehow, I see no other way. I see no other way for the Federation other than this impossible. Well, not necessarily impossible, but just so entirely unlikely. Right? If you see no other way than this, and this is your objective, then somebody has to tell you, look, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And if you're serious about the liberation of Africa, and for all intents and purposes, that's, you know, we understand Diop to be serious. So if you are serious, then drop this goal. You understand? This is why information, like Marcus Garvey says, never forget that intelligence rules the world and ignorance carries the burden. This is not intelligence. How would the wielding of political power be organized? So a collegial system of political leadership could be envisaged based on the concept of rotation. For instance, an executive council of the Federated States. All right. An executive council of the Federated States comprised of the heads of those states could be set up. The Federated States would have to accept a permanent, irrevocable transfer of part of their national sovereignty to such an executive council. That is, from the outset, the nucleus of Federated States would integrate their defense, economy, external trade, civil service, and foreign affairs. These are prerogatives of the Federal Executive Council. Equally, universities and scientific research centers would be unified and rationalized on a federal basis. The president of such a federation could be elected from within the Federal Executive Council itself. The system could be adopted at a first stage, since continental-wide elections presuppose the existence of a continental federation. Inasmuch as this function of a federal president would be symbolized by a person, such a person could be one of the heads of the Federated States. Leadership, however, would be exercised on a collegial basis. Also, the presidency of the Federal Executive Council would be on a rotative basis. Every 2, 4, or 7 years, whatever the case may be, the presidency would go on to one of the heads of the Federated States. We need some kind of convenient formula that would ensure stability. In fact, we would even envision a rotative system based on alphabetical order. I want to just say this though, right? Like it's just like you're reading this thing. These nations in Africa, a lot of these nations in Africa, a lot of these leaders in Africa are not even willing to have honest elections. Okay, let's face the facts. Like, face the facts that, truly speaking, a lot of people are not willing to have honest elections. If you're in power, you do not want to lose power. All right? If you're in power, you do not want to lose power. Okay? Not only does this scheme say, hey, lose power, but also have honest elections? The leadership, a lot of the leadership in Africa already wouldn't be leadership in Africa if they had honest elections. Come on. And then to top that off, you got to say to yourself, like, who's gonna be voting? I mean, this is honestly, this is sad. You may not see how it's sad, but this is sad. And we need some kind of, like, it's just so naive. It's so naive, but you know, for such a brilliant man, it's so naive. And of course, like you could just imagine what kind of emotions he was flushed with when this didn't succeed, but it could not succeed, because it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and it's ridiculous in the sense of, you have to think of Africa in terms of the people in power. Okay? You have to think of Africa in terms of the people in power. And the people in power would look at this and be like, why would I do this? Like, what do I gain from doing this? You understand? What do I gain? And you may say, hey, you know, African people will benefit, and that may be the case. It may not be the case. But the people in power, what does that have to do with them? Or even if you are in power, like, say if I'm in power, right? Let's say I'm the president of some place. I'm the president of some place. Why would I think getting into a federation with one of my neighboring states, right? Let's say the neighboring states is war-torn and all that crap. Why would I think that getting into a federation with that neighboring state would be to my people's benefit? Are you listening? This would, I'm just telling you, like it's mathematics, okay? Mathematics says, you know, one of the rules I learned in this mathematics training session was, just go for the simplest problem. If you were the leader of a state, if you achieved the leadership of a state, no matter how you did it, whether it was through a coup, whether it was through the election process, whether it was a fixed election or an honest election, whatever it was, would you then give away your power to a federation of a bunch of states that are otherwise dysfunctional? Come on. That's if, and you may be from a dysfunctional state yourself, but why would you give away your power to other dysfunctional countries anyway? And you might say, well, the dysfunction has to do with the fact that we're not in a federation, right? But is it that? Honestly. Wait, is it? Alright, this would eliminate the types of rivalries that... Alright, so here he goes. What it needs some kind of convenient formula that would ensure stability. In fact, we would even envision a rotative system based on alphabetical order. This would eliminate the type of rivalries that could jeopardize the stable functioning of such a federal state. The important thing is that the Federal Executive Council be a truly democratic and collegial body, open to discussions and thorough analysis of each and every problem that might affect Africa as a whole. However, once decisions have been democratically arrived at by consensus, okay, oh, right, what is he talking about? All federated states should be bound to them. In synthesis, I am in favor of any sort of formula that would allow African peoples and countries to bind together democratically in defense of their common interests, and that would ensure their own survival. So, Africa asks, on the informal plane, what measures would you suggest for arousing a continental African consciousness? We can go on and on, but a practical thing leading to a continental consciousness is inter-African contacts on an informal, free, and leisurely basis. An aspect of the problem of the unification of the African continent, and which is seldom stressed, deals with an inter-African tourist circuit. A special agency must be created for this purpose. Africans do not know Africa. How can you love a country or have faith in its destiny if you don't know it? All the more, how can we love our continent or develop a continental consciousness without knowing it? So I like this, the idea of, inter-African continent contacts and just tourism, like a tourist circuit, throughout Africa for African people I actually like this. Some people complain about tourism. Unfortunately, I've actually yet to have gone to Africa. I wanted to go this year. If you didn't know, there was a freaking national pandemic around this time that stopped pretty much air flight and all that kind of crap. And the state that I was interested in going to had this policy where I'd have to be stranded for, let's say, 2 weeks, when on my own dime kind of stuff. So it was just not worth it. Obstacles to emancipation and unity. Afriscope. The Western Bloc is setting up South Africa as a permanent white bastion state enclaved in Africa. The Bantustan policy and so-called independence of Transkei are the corollaries to this plot. Isn't the existence of a white South Africa a monumental obstacle in the way of a continental African state? Without a shadow of a doubt. The setting up of a continental African state presupposes the ratification of the South African threat. The establishment of a white state anywhere on the continent of Africa is inconceivable and inadmissible. The whites who are in southern Africa could remain there, but only within the framework of black majority rule. A borderline between a white state and a black state is inconceivable. Sooner or later, it will lead to a racial war. The white South African regime is a permanent danger which should act as a mobilizing force for all Africans. We should have no illusion about this. It is either unity or destruction. With the active complicity of the West, fascist South Africa is enveloping its nuclear capability at an alarming speed. This poses a threat of extermination of black peoples, yet some African leaders insist that dialogue is the only way of averting the danger. And so this is actually pretty interesting. So this is during a time before South Africa had a nuclear weapon. South Africa actually gets a nuclear weapon, and at the same time there were African leaders who were like, hey, let's only dialogue with South Africa. They won't have a nuclear bomb. And of course they do. It's so amazing. Nothing could be more dangerous than to initiate dialogue with white South Africa. It would merely give her the necessary time to put the finishing touches on her nuclear program, which she did. Understand that. White South Africa did have the finishing touches on their nuclear program. And it was only dismantled after there was quote-unquote black rule. But that's what you have to see. South Africa only believes in one solution and speaks only one language, brute force. Look at Soweto. To the white fascist leaders of South Africa, any black country is Soweto. South Africa is feverishly preparing for a showdown. Pretoria now knows that any technically organized minority, fully equipped and enjoying a highly educational standard, can successfully face and repulse by violent means an entire continent which have remained at this level of semi-development. South Africa is actively working to achieve an equilibrium of terror. Pretoria is going about acquiring the most sophisticated and efficient nuclear weapons, along with the vectors to deliver them to any point on the African continent. Oh my gosh. So I like a lot of people that I appreciate are in Azania. Okay? A lot of people I appreciate are in Azania. And because of that, I want to take this screenshot, okay? I love Azania, okay? I love South Africa. And because I love South Africa, I want to put this up, and I want to tell South Africa, check this one out. All right? This is beautiful. All right. South Africa is virtually a nuclear power and is preparing to put up. Oh, but let me actually just highlight what exactly I was talking about. Look at this. Any technically organized minority, fully equipped and enjoying a high educational standard, can successfully face and repulse by violent means an entire continent which has remained at the level of semi-development. This is really important because when he says a minority, any technologically organized minority, you should look at that to mean you too. All right? Yes, you're an African. Okay? You are an African. But let's say we are the Oncopia, okay? We can then be a minority, all right? We are an African minority, of course, but we're still a minority. And the lesson here, the lesson that South Africa teaches you, is that any minority, doesn't have to be a Eurasian minority, but any minority fully equipped and enjoying a highly educational standard can face the entire continent, okay? Can face the entire continent. And now you don't want to face the entire continent in the oppositional sense necessarily, But what you want to do with the continent is bring it up. Bring it up. You understand? Bring this content. Because, see, imagine what an organized majority, fully equipped and enjoying a highly educational standard, what it can do for the entire world. It can face the entire world. You understand? And of course you might say, well, the world is not at a semi-developmental level. No. But if your power, if what you can do as a minority, you can do more as a majority. You see what I'm saying? So this is why I encourage for you to look into like the literature that can bring us into that higher development, if you will, that higher educational standard, and that equipment, that technical equipment. Okay. South Africa is virtually a nuclear power and is preparing to put up a long and terrible resistance to the rest of the continent. Objectively speaking, South Africa does not consider anyone on the continent as her friend, on the African continent as her friend. What we have are those so-called pacifists who are trying to camouflage their cowardice and capitulation by proposing a so-called dialogue with a regime that has vowed to destroy the black man. The policy of dialogue with South Africa, presented to us as the product of political realism, can only be judged as political blindness or the surrender of the best interest of African peoples. It takes two to dialogue. South Africa is not seeking dialogue, but time. Necessary time to develop her nuclear arsenal. I don't think any African leader ignores this, though some pretend to. And we know this. Whereas it was previously perceived that Pretoria would fabricate nuclear weapons by 1983, the latest developments force us to drastically revise that prediction. South Africa is now in the position to become a full nuclear power within the next few years at maximum. If only for this reason, the struggle for the overthrow of white supremacist South Africans must be intensified immediately. No compromise, no procrastination. The armed struggle in Southern Africa must be intensified immediately. It is the only way to avert a nuclear war in Africa in the near future. And here's the thing, though. There is no nuclear war. But, what can you say? Once South Africa acquires nuclear weapons, it will be too late. At that time, the African states, which are today invoking realism to justify their inaction and capitulation in face of Pretoria, will definitely have a good argument to preach permanent peaceful coexistence with the white South African regime. And this is something to realize, that even though there was nuclear weapons in South Africa, none of this manifested. So this is why, this is why you want to study history, because what happens is that you can make false predictions, and whereas this way of seeing, like back then, it might have seemed like, yeah, he's right, there's gonna be a nuclear war, oh man, we're gonna watch out. Like, it never really manifested that way. Eventually, South Africa did, cater to international pressures, if you will. And it did not, let's say, exterminate the black race, but whatever. Peaceful coexistence. However, what they might not realize is that once South Africa acquires nuclear weapons, a modus vivendi will be impossible, no matter how much African states bend over. Once South African states acquire nuclear weapons, she will take the offensive. Therein lies the reason why a borderline between a white and black state is impossible on the African continent. It signified war sooner or later. South Africa knows it and is preparing for it. It is irrational to think that any African, wherever he may be, can make plans for the future as long as the South African threat is not eradicated. South Africa is the stumbling block in the way of African development. In fact, it has become imperative to liberate South Africa in time so as to avert a nuclear war. To wait is to allow South Africa the time to leisurely develop its nuclear capability. If this is allowed, there will be an equilibrium of terror whereby the other African states will be impotent to act. So in the interest of world peace itself, we must immediately intensify the struggle for the liberation of Southern Africa. Now, he really believes in this. Now, again, it's just never manifested. Otherwise, so it's almost like a conspiracy theory. But I mean, it's a reasonable one. I like this one, but still, this is why I say, what can I do? I say, what can I do? And I also look at the world and I just say, okay, this is the world. Well, this is why I talk about realism and being realistic. You know, like what do people in this world want? Do people want to exterminate black people? Do people want to exploit black people? Like, you have to understand who you're dealing with. And this is why I don't even understand why this man is married to a white woman if he doesn't even understand her. It's kind of weird. But anyway, otherwise, whatever political or other projects we might conceive will be devoid of any meaning. The racist regime of South Africa must be liquidated without delay. Otherwise, there will be an atomic war in Africa in the next 5 to 10 years. Already, within less than 6 years from now, South Africa will dispose of a small stockpile of nuclear weapons, quite enough to create mass panic among Africans. Anyway, so this is weird. Technologically speaking, at what stage of development can South Africa's nuclear capabilities be assessed now? With the complicity of the West, South Africa has been able to come up with an absolutely revolutionary and efficient method for the separation of isotopes. When first announced, it was believed Pretoria was bluffing. It was no bluff at all. At Velindaba, there is a pilot center where South Africa has been able to experiment with a new method of isotopic separation. She was helped by the German firm Steg. That center is now fully operational and can allow Pretoria to assemble the most difficult of atomic bombs, that is, the uranium-235 bomb. Moreover, South Africa definitely has the know-how of reprocessing spent nuclear reactor fuel, uranium fuel. She can therefore manufacture plutonium atomic bombs. Spent uranium is the waste from a nuclear power reactor that, when processed through a special reprocessing plant, creates plutonium. It takes another 13 pounds of plutonium to make a small atomic bomb. That's the editor. Thus, with her present nuclear installation, South Africa can build atomic bombs based on plutonium-239. Furthermore, she will be able to go directly into the U-235 category. This is extremely serious. For unless science comes up with another shortcut, the U-235 bomb is indispensable as a trigger for a thermonuclear bomb. What all of this means is that South Africa is not only in possession of advanced nuclear technology and on the verge of building classical plutonium atomic bombs, but more importantly, very close to the thermonuclear stage. Right now, South Africa has what we can call a nuclear capability. I don't believe she will wait another 5 or 6 or 10 years to build atomic weapons, considering the mounting political pressure she faces from Black Africa. At present, she would have to enlarge the pilot installation she sent. She would have to the pilot installation she already has, discreetly improve it and make it run day and night to isolate enough U-235 to build the type of bomb acquirable without a nuclear plant. It is quite possible that Pretoria already has the data whereby she could manufacture an atomic bomb without the need for a nuclear plant. Needless to say, whenever South Africa does acquire a nuclear plant, her production of fissionable material will have been multiplied by 100. Whereas she may now be able to build 1 or 2 bombs, with a nuclear plant she'll be turning out 100 bombs instead. There's no doubt about that. The danger is staring us in the eyes. In fact, the situation will be unattainable wherever her nuclear plants become operational. South Africa invaded Angola in 1975. Israel attacked Uganda in 1976. I didn't even know that. They're really far. Israel and South Africa are allies. They are both virtual nuclear powers. Shouldn't we read in their actions against Africa an ominous sign of things to come? Concerning South Africa, the dangers are real. There's no question about it. The connivance between South Africa and Israel is really astonishing. One would have thought that a people such as the Israelis, who had suffered from racism in modern times, would have aligned themselves with black people. No, I would not have thought that. Why would anybody think that? Okay, Joe, come on. That's the miscegenation right there. The veritable historical victims of racism. To my great surprise, I realized that something essential was missing in the relationship between black and Israeli peoples. We have seen Israel choose the Western camp, yet the recent past of the Israeli people would have justified the expectance of their aligning themselves with those who have also suffered as the Israelis, if not more, from the ravages of racism. In other words, we would have expected Israel to have sided with black people, particularly, and the third world in general. We would have expected. What is he talking about? That's what I'm saying. What are you talking about? That's what. What? No. All right. We would have expected a non-expansionist attitude on the part of Israel, which is not the case. We would have expected understanding on the part of Israel, which is not the case. We would have expected sympathy from the Israelis for the cause of the Third World in general, which is not the case. Instead, Israel chose the Western camp. Of course, a bunch of Westerners were going to choose the Western camp. What? Anyway, after Vorster's visit to Israel, are we not to fear that Tel Aviv will help Pretoria develop its nuclear weapons? The Israeli-South African alliance defies the imagination. Like, what do you talk? Oh my gosh! Like, how do you read this? That's what I'm saying. Like, what you have to understand the people. You have to. Like, the strange thing is that Diop, you would think Diop would understand them because he has the southern and northern cradle theory. You know, he has the southern cradle theory and the northern cradle theory. So you would think he would understand white folk, and he's married to a white person. So you would think he would understand white people, and then he says this kind of stuff where it's like, no reasonable person would think this. Like, nobody, especially not today, nobody would think this. The Israeli-South African alliance defies the imagination. Like, nobody would say that today. Against all expectations, Israel has done the unimaginable. From this point on, anything can be expected. We know Israel to be in possession of a small stockpile of operational nuclear weapons and to be highly advanced technological nation. We're now justified in believing that Israel will put her advanced nuclear technology at the disposal of the fascist South African regime, enabling it to skip the stages in the obtaining of operational nuclear weapons. More specifically, Israel is in the position to help South Africa develop the triggering device for her nuclear weapons. In fact, with Israeli aid, South African atomic scientists and engineers will be able to considerably cut down the period normally necessary for achieving operational nuclear devices. This new alarming development is to be feared. South Africa has the raw materials, advanced technology, and the material means to become a nuclear power in a very short period of time. With Israeli aid, that period of time will be even shorter. Moreover, once Pretoria will have received the nuclear plants recently negotiated with France, she will be able to multiply by 100 her nuclear capacity production. As I've said before, I fear South Africa will manufacture nuclear weapons in a record time, thus surprising the entire African continent. Once this becomes a fait accompli, the struggle against South Africa will have acquired entirely new and foreboding consequences. So once South Africa is ready to take the offensive, no doubt using nuclear weapons, isn't it conceivable that Israel would equally join Pretoria in a two-pronged assault against the black continent? South Africa, no doubt, wouldn't hesitate to commit nuclear genocide on the black people of Africa. In fact, it's certain that such a plan is in the back of the minds of the white supremacist leaders of that black country. Could we foresee the possibility that Israel from the Middle East and South Africa from the southern tip of the continent would combine their forces to launch a nuclear attack on black Africa with the aim of exterminating its people? An answer to that question is perforce hazardous. Yet in view of recent events, we must pay the most serious attention to the strategic possibility of that nature. So I think it's actually pretty interesting because, again, what would happen to the resources of Africa if that were to happen? That's the question. If they're looking to exploit the resources of Africa, why would they nuke the continent? You see what I'm saying? Not to say that they wouldn't nuke the continent. It's just a matter of like you have to understand what people want. Like the mass extermination of African people might not necessarily be the main objective. Like, would they exterminate a few? Like would they exterminate a lot of people and subject you to their control out of fear? Sure, but would they just wipe out all the black people? And to do that, wipe out all the resources as well. I mean, it's like I don't like it's just outside of like again, it didn't happen. One. If it did happen, it wouldn't make like it didn't happen because we're here talking about it, right? But also, it's just so like it's imaginative. It's just a lot of imagination, to say the least. All right. So, do you think that Israel's position in the Middle East vis-a-vis Arabs is analogous to the position of white South Africa in respect to Africans? Within the Arab world, the state of Israel finds itself in an entirely different context. My opinion is that whether one likes it or not, the state of Israel will in the long run be absorbed by the Arab world. Wow, okay. True, there's a technological gap between both at present. As long as the portion of the Arabs world remains at a nomadic stage, Israeli technology will of course make itself felt. In that context, Israel will continue to appear as a Western prolongation in the Middle East. However, Middle Eastern Arab countries will develop technologically, closing the present gap. The state of Israel will then be completely absorbed demographically by the Arab world. So, that's something that you have to pick up on. So, he's saying, look, if the Arabs develop technologically, then they can potentially absorb Israel. So what does that mean? That means that in Israel's interest, it's in Israel's interest to prevent the Arab technological advancement. Okay, and now you have to juxtapose that with the African continent. White people do not want you to have the technological advance, because if you have a technological advance, you can eventually absorb anything that they have on the continent. You see what I'm saying? You could push away their foothold. So that's why they are politically organized towards your political disorganization. Sorry, let me get a cough for a second. All right. You know where I cover my mouth. However, Middle Eastern countries will develop technologically closing the present gap. The state of Israel will then be completely absorbed. All right. Therefore, in the long run, the Arab-Israeli conflict will abate. In fact, the state of Israel would right now desist from its bellicose attitude and would seek a viable modus vivendi with their Arab neighbors. Arab-Islam peace would come about very quickly. My opinion is that the Arab-Israeli conflict necessarily evolved in the direction of a peaceful solution acceptable to both parties. So again, like what's the time scale for this? Sorry. This is all the more likely given the historical context underlying the relationship of these two Semitic people. I foresee a time in the near future when the Arab and Israeli ethnic groups, which have a very old common historical past in the Middle East, will peacefully resolve their differences. So again, this is like a huge misunderstanding. I don't even know where this guy's like I don't know what he's reading. This is more European history, so I don't really have a book for that myself. But yeah, like some people will tell you that the Israeli is the Euro Jew, and the Euro Jew in fact does not have those long-standing background in Israel, and he might not even be a Semitic as much as he may be a Japhetic. So there's that. It's almost like, what are you talking about? I mean, of course, I'm not like, you don't have to quote me on that, because like I said, I don't really care for white people like that, the Eurasians like that. But as far as I understand, a lot of these Euro Jews were in fact like from Europe. You know what I mean? And they've and a lot of them were converts to the religion. Like, that's something that I really want. That's what I really mean, is to say that they weren't necessarily descended from the original group of quote unquote Semitics. And a Semitic, as you may or may not know, is semi, and semi being half, as to say that they were just a bunch of mulattoes or mixed people between like Africans and I would say Europeans or something, but or maybe even Asians or whatever. But the point being that like that's what a Semitic is. It's more an like a group of mulattoes. Whereas if you were like in Europe for too long, you're not really a Semitic technically, a Semite technically. You know, you're just a European. The defeat of Israel can easily be determined by the geographic context of the Middle East. Israel finds herself too isolated in that region not to ultimately seek a peaceful solution. So again, you know, what is he talking about? Israel is still live and popping today. Arab and Israeli cultures are very close to one another. Don't know what he's talking about. Such affinities extend into the realm of religion. As we know, the Muslim and Judaic religions emerged from a common source, from practically a common people, and from the same geographical area. Eventually, both Semitic groups will again fuse. None of the foregoing considerations apply to South Africa in regard to the rest of Africa. So the aim of Pan-Arabism, as defined by Gamal Abdul Nasser, is the formation of a federation of North African and Asian Arab states as a single political and economic entity. Doesn't that project conflict with that of a federal continental African state? The way I see it is that there already exists a continental African consciousness. For lack of a precise Pan-African project, however, certain North African Arab countries might be tempted to group separately with Asian Arabs. In fact, of the disunity and uncertainty characteristic of intra-African politics, North African Arab states might indeed be instinctively tempted to seek fusion with their Middle Eastern brethren. Nevertheless, I believe that a continent-wide African consciousness does exist already. When you go to North Africa, to Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, for example, you can detect an African behavior. We can build on this as long as an effort is made to forget many painful things of the past. Africans to the north and south of the continent must think in terms of uniting, because it is in their global interest to do so. If we can overcome prejudice and fears through information and open discussion, then the advantage of a continental federal state are apparent. We might nuance our opinion on the steps to be taken towards establishing such a state. To begin with, there could be a federation of the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt on the one hand, while on the other a federation of all the sub-Saharan African countries. A confederation of these two federations could then be envisioned. With time, both entities could fuse so as to arrive at a true continental federal state. This is possible. Hence, the North and South could be federated independently, then subsequently fused. A lot of effort would have to be expended in destroying prejudices, fears, and susceptibilities, and creating the basis for a common understanding between North African Arabs and Sub-Saharan Africans. So, this was pretty straightforward. But again, it's just this very imaginative, that they're going to have the Federation of the Maghrebs, and they're going to have the Federation of Sub-Saharan African countries, and that federation is going to become a confederation, and that confederation is going to itself become a come on. Really? It's just not realistic. A lot of this just doesn't make any sense, especially read in hindsight. But, probably wouldn't have made sense if you were reading it at that point, too. You would say, hey, this is a really brilliant scientist, a really brilliant scholar, but I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. I don't know what he's talking about. But let's go. Nevertheless, Arab countries are increasingly forming exclusive organizations of all kinds, from which sub-Saharan African states are excluded, but which include Asian and North African Arabs. In fact, there are no less than 25 such organizations. The most recently formed are UNESCO, an exclusively Arab UNESCO, and Qats Arab, or Standing Arab Scientific Conference. That sounds interesting, huh? Besides, isn't there a discrepancy in North African Arab states being members simultaneously of the Arab League and the OAU? And he says, I won't deny that there are great difficulties in bringing Arab North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa together in a federal continental political union. Difficulties do exist. I still continue to believe, however, that an African continental state is vital to the survival of all Africans, to the north and south of the Sahara. Ways and means must be found to overcome the obstacles in its path. So you see there's no answers. It's like, hey, this is difficult, but we need it to happen, and we know it doesn't happen. And the thing is this, it's not going to happen. What can happen is for us as African people, us as African leaders, to say, look, let us go on the continent and build up community centers, build up universities, build up professional class, build up these nations, these micro nations turning into nations, and just build upon our continent so that we can now acquire sovereignty. We can be located all over and channel the resources into central hubs, and these central hubs themselves can become nations organically within nations and unite and have. And then let's say we have politicians. We could then, let's say somebody wins an election and they say, hey, you know what? I'm a part of the Ancobia. The neighboring state next to me is a part of the Ancobia, or the majority of this government is a pro-Ancobia party, and the majority of that government is a pro-Ancobia party. We all know about Tanzania. Let us do what Tanzania did and unite and make one larger country that benefits our people far and wide. That right there is possible, but it requires you to do some work, and that work is outlined in a book, and that book is the Book of Power. And if you want to know more about the Book of Power, guess what? I'll sing it to you. All right. This is Change the Leaders and Lead the Changers by Onitaset Kumat. Okay, so I know books. All right. So let me tell you about a book. All right.
Check it. So the goal and objective is to be selective, elective for knowledge with the black directive. Checking sources, heritage, and legacies with the brilliance to defeat our nemesis. The book of power, so aptly named, esteemed and famed for informing the brain and doing the same as the ancestors before us. Sankofa, that's the life chorus. Wisdom is the key against dangers.
How to change the leaders, lead the changes.
We are doing Africa with no strangers.
Hey, do you hear us?
Okay, hold on. We can't continue to beat the second fiddle. African power is the end of this riddle. To build a nation, the likes which never existed. The motto heretofore, we persisted. Better, we resisted. Best, we building. We'll raise the roof and break through the ceiling. Feeling a way the change we were given. To stop just surviving, start thriving and living. Africa's about to host superpowers. China and US back up in time hours. No one can be free without freeing themselves. But freedom is shown and owned on bookshelves. The book of power, a key for liberation. There's no domination where there's education. Because ignorance is man's main weakness. All are exploited if we don't teach this. Then the pages of sages, kings and queens. Akhenaten, Delaney, Dessalines, Nyerere, Garvey and Zinga and Cooks. 500 pages to pass in most books. The task is told to bring up a continent. You will hold the tone for the confident. Have some pride and push forward your chest. Your leaders by reading one of the best. The book has science, covers violence, self-reliance, and does away with silence. The time has come for the work to get done and build up a land that be second to none. We'll organize, technologize, and strategize a new Africa before our eyes, and blackness will be the complexion we see anytime we envision what it means to be free. So come join minds, read what is written. Here be solutions, no longer hidden. Nothing works in theory, all that works, works and works. So it's time to put ourselves first. Change the leaders and lead the changes. Tell your friends, family, and neighbors. Change the leaders and lead the changes. Tell your friends, family, and neighbors. Change the leaders and lead the changes. Tell your friends, family, and neighbors. Change the leaders and lead the changes. Book of Power. So the Book of Power can be purchased on Amazon. Just click on the link below. Alright, send me on tap. Tulende ma'at, tushinde is fat. Tulende ma'at, tushinde is fat. Tulende ma'at, tushinde is fat. Hotep.
Hotep. Alright, family. like we need solutions. We need solutions. It's not enough to know there are problems. You also need to solve them. And you know it's true because I rhymed. Alright, family. Where are we at? Where are we at? I feel like it might have been right here. Difficulties do exist. Yeah. Supposing the assumption of a common historical destiny between North African and Asian Arabs proves stronger than the Pan-African community interest you speak of. So like, this is like a participle. It's not a real question, but the thing I want to say is this brother really wants North Africa. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, if despite goodwill on our part, North African Arabs were to refuse the Continental Federation, then nothing should stand in the way of the formation of an exclusively sub-Saharan Continental Federation. By the way, you want to avoid using the word sub-Saharan, but you know, we all know that's not that important. Nothing should stand in the way of a formation of an exclusively sub-Saharan Continental Federation. However, I feel that if the perspective of a Continental Federation were clearly defined, backed by a strong sub-Saharan wish in this direction, the North African states would have to reconsider their position on that score, when if prior to that they were thinking along other lines. Should this not be the case, then Black Africa couldn't be blamed in the future for grouping along purely sub-Saharan lines. The fault would not be ours. Nevertheless, I think we must push the experience to its logical conclusions. Gamal Abdul Nasser's project was that of an Arab nation from the Nile to the Euphrates. Egypt tried to federate with Syria and northern Yemen. Libya has now taken up the project. The very failure of the Egyptian-Syrian Federation shows how difficult it is for African states to look outside of Africa for a federation. In fact, that failure should be a warning. A political federation involving states situated in Africa cannot be extra-African. Nothing prevents North African Arab states within the context of a continental African state to maintain cultural contacts with Arabs or Asia with whom they share a common language. Again, it would be as if Black Africans were prevented from establishing close cultural links with blacks of the Americas and the rest of the black world. One thing is to establish cultural ties, and another to form a political federation. This is absolutely clear. Our objective must be the creation of an economic and politically federated continent. All Africans who express a desire to build such a federation, irrespective of whether they be from the North or Sub-Saharan Africa, must be welcomed on an equal footing. I am convinced that if vigorous propaganda were made in this sense, we would end up with very positive results. So, and again, if vigorous propaganda, where does the financing for this propaganda come from? You know? However, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya and others still agitate along these lines. So this is Muammar Gaddafi. So this is back when, apparently, when Gaddafi was doing the... Well, let's see. We know what happened with Gaddafi. Obizi. Obizi put a bullet, I guess, into him. But alright. People must have entire freedom to talk and expound their views, even when these ideas are not realizable. My opinion is that too many diverse... Oh yeah, so look, so he says, let's actually pay attention right here. So he said Libya has now taken the project. So Libya has taken the project. So he's talking about Gaddafi here. Okay? So this is like saying Gaddafi had... Like people always say Gaddafi was first trying to do Pan-Arabism before he went to Pan-Africanism. And this is what he's saying. Like this is during that time. People must have entire freedom to talk and expound their views, even when their ideas are not realizable. And see, this is ironic for him to say, because these are ideas that are not realizable. My opinion is that too many divergencies exist for such a project to materialize. The concept of an Arab state from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf is devoid of any economic base, whereas I can very well conceive of North African states joining the rest of Africa to form a viable political economic entity. As I said, membership in such a continental political arrangement should not prevent North African Arabs from continuing to entertain close cultural links with the Arabs of Asia. By the same token, a continental political federation, including North African Arabs, should in no way prevent black Africans from entertaining the closest cultural links with blacks of the Americas, Oceania, and Asia. It is absolutely indispensable to make the difference between relationships based on a cultural continuum and those based on a geopolitical entity. You know, and another example you want to see, of course, is America with Europe. Okay? Then that's a white example, obviously. Suppose Asian and North African Arabs short-circuited black Africa and agreed to set up what Gaddafi has been agitating for. So suppose Asian and North African Arabs short-circuited black Africa and agreed to set up what Gaddafi has been agitating for. So if that were ever to be the case, then it would be explicitly clear that a federation with black Africa was being rejected. If we black Africans take steps to include North African Arabs into a continental federation, and the latter prefers instead to elaborate organic political ties with Arabs of Asia, this would be tantamount to a rebuff. If North African states, rather than looking to black Africa in a natural partnership, preferred a federation with Asian Arabs extending to the Persian Gulf, then we would be entirely justified to organize ourselves in an exclusively sub-Saharan federation. In such an eventuality, no one could accuse sub-Saharan Africans of being guilty of exclusivism, since their appeals to the North would have been refused. However, I do not really envision this being the case. Rather, my feeling is that the necessary ideological and propaganda work in favor of an all-inclusive continental federation has to be undertaken as of now. Many Africans argue that the very cohesion of the Arabs as an ethno-cultural entity would pose the problem of their dominating any confederal arrangement. Sub-Saharan Africans must realize that they have nothing to lose culturally, politically, or otherwise in a federation which includes Arab North Africa. So this is a really important question, because a lot of times we talk about... Actually, I think if you look into Good Brother, he has a good... how do you say... acronym, I think? Initials. Good initials. Obadale Kambon. Obadale Kambon, right? He has good initials, okay, right? You get it? No? Okay. And he was saying, look, Pan-Africanism, there's two different types of Pan-Africanism. There's the continental Pan-Africanism and the racial Pan-Africanism. And Cheikh A Diop here is kind of saying you could do both. You could unite the continent and you could unite the race. Now, some people would say, no, I don't want to unite the race and the continent, because that doesn't make any damn sense if the continent... But other people would raise the point that there are black people in these Arab countries. You understand? There are black people in Arab North Africa. Like, that's without a doubt. Okay? And to reject that, to reject them, but now the only question is, what would the Federation comprise? And again, the Federation thing is so unrealistic, so it goes back to this. You know, you might have freedom to talk, but your ideas are not realizable. There's not going to be a sub-Saharan African Federation. Okay? Not unless there's a powerful African state. There's a first powerful African state. You have to have a powerful African state that says, you know what, we're doing this. And that's really what we have to be about as Sankofa. But let's keep reading. Black Africa would not be an appendage of the Arab world in such a federation. There's a distinct African identity which can and ought to be continued to develop. In the past 20 years, a lot of work has been done in terms of reinforcing the cultural, linguistic, and historical identity of African peoples. The black world has reinforced its cultural personality. As a consequence of this development, our cultural, linguistic, and historical personality can no longer be strangled in any way by cultural context with other peoples. The time has come for us to abandon our complexes and work in favor of a union that is favorable to all Africans. That's the crux of the matter. In the final analysis, what is really at the core of the controversy of whether North and Sub-Saharan Africans can join in a common federation is the question, are we culturally ready to meet with the Arab world? Are we culturally ready to join in a common federation without surrendering an inch of our cultural, linguistic, and historical identity as black Africans? This is the real question. My answer is affirmative. Black Africa has recovered its cultural personality to an extent and vigor which makes it impossible for anyone to strangle it. What remains to be done is the day-to-day work of solidifying and redefining in all areas of the contours of our distinct personality. Considering all of the efforts which have been accomplished in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the restoration of our historical and cultural identity, Africans no longer have to fear being dominated by the Arabs. Okay. Well, don't you think that another serious... So he's really... This interviewer really wants this North African question explored. And it's like, I don't give a... Like, come on. Don't you think that another serious stumbling block in the way of the constitution of a continental state would appear to be the entrenchment of a staunchly egoistic neo-colonial regimes both in North and Sub-Saharan Africa? Definitely. It's obvious that once we eliminate difficulties of a subjective nature, that is, whether North and Sub-Saharan Africa do or do not want to federate, there remains the objective obstacles of a political nature. The egoistic nature of certain political regimes north and south of the Sahara is such that they are terrified at the idea of a continental African state. The stranglehold of alien economic interests is not foreign to that fear. The neo-colonial country of such regimes is therefore an objective factor in the way of constituting a continental federation. African unity, I feel, will come from the base and develop as an undercurrent to the present political sterility and economic stagnancy rampant on our continent. A feeling of general insecurity generated by the ineptitude of African regimes in dealing with the most crucial issues, including that of South Africa, will result in the masses entering the picture sooner or later. As generalized insecurity spreads, no African regime will be able to prevent the masses from seeing that the ineptitude of their own government is linked to this general insecurity. At that point, I feel the masses will find within their own ranks the type of political vanguards made up of young, altruistic, and politically motivated Africans to unleash a powerful continent-wide movement. Actually, hold on. Let me actually... To unleash... Yeah, because you see, this is the stuff that I'm talking about. Like, you can't be too idealistic. You have to be more realistic. So let's look at this. African unity, I feel, will come from the base and develop as an undercurrent to the present political sterility and economic stagnancy rampant on our continent. So again, this didn't happen. A feeling of general insecurity generated by the ineptitude of African regimes in dealing with the most crucial issues, including that of South Africa, will result in the masses entering the picture sooner or later. Again, the masses are not going to mobilize. You have to understand nations to realize that the masses are not going to mobilize without leadership. Without organizations, they're not going to mobilize. Okay? They're not going to. And the reason why I can say that definitively is because I'm talking about this in 2020. Okay? He's talking about this in 1970, about what's going to eventually happen. I'm talking about this in 2020, 50 years later. Okay? That's a huge difference. as generalized insecurity. And so you cannot ignore 50 years. You see what I'm saying? You do not want to ignore 50 years. You want to say, okay, all right? As generalized insecurity spreads, no African regime will be able to prevent the masses from seeing that the ineptitude of their own government is linked to their general insecurity. At that point, I feel that the masses will find within their own ranks the type of political vanguards made up of young, altruistic, and politically motivated Africans to unleash a powerful continent-wide movement. So if you want this to happen, again, you have to engage in the propaganda of sharing the literature or some sort of study, some sort of political studying. But I recommend, my literature for only having the most advanced political studies. But you want to have you have to be organizing. You have to be organizing. If you're not organizing, nothing will come about. Nothing came about. Nothing. The political undercurrent would eventually be forced to sweep away the objective obstacles standing in the way of a continental African federation. Ideological black bipolarity seems to be installing itself in African politics. What ideological preference, in your view, would the united foreign policy of a continental African state reflect? A continental African state must, of necessity, be non-aligned. Africa, then, will be a continent with its own specific political personality. In time, Africa would have to play a world role. A continental African state must be an end in itself. It would even be humiliating to conceive of a continental African state being towed as a vessel by any other state, government, or bloc. A continental African state would entertain relations with all other countries on a perfectly equal footing. How else could Africa lift itself to the level of the other powerful states and deal with the rest of the world from a position of true independence? Today, only 3 states could be considered as independent: the United States, the Soviet Union, China. So that's a pretty interesting... Oh, okay, so he's saying... Sorry. So I thought it was a question for a second. So he's saying there's only really 3 independent states: United States, the Soviet Union, and China. These 3 states are organized on a continental basis. That's no accident. Significantly, Europe is now trying desperately to federate itself into one continental state. Highly industrial and technological European states are trying to elect a pan-European parliament, establish an economic common market, attempting to unify their defense and foreign policies, and preaching in favor of the continental federal approach. That's an edifying example for us Africans. So I want to say this, though. This is a misunderstanding. I feel like this is a conspiracy theory kind of thing, where people think that there's only 3 countries that are independent. Realistically speaking, all the countries are independent. Okay? Like, if you're going to the real world, all of these countries are independent, but they do engage in economic relationships, and they do engage in political sabotage. So the United States does politically sabotage other countries. Soviet Union does politically sabotage other countries, but that doesn't necessarily say that they're not independent. It just means that, like, politics, it's just an aspect of politics. Like you have to understand that just an aspect of politics, because again, right now America is going through like it has while I'm publishing this, in 2020, the president of the United States is this person named Donald Trump. He was like Russia pretty much put the guy in power. Okay, so the Soviet Union doesn't exist today, but the USSR does, and that's pretty much the Soviet. Oh no, sorry, it's not the USSR. It's Russia. But so Russia is the country now, and Russia sabotaged the United States government. But that doesn't mean that the United States isn't independent. It just means that that Russia is playing the game of war, if you will. It's playing the game of war, and that's what everybody else is playing, and you have to play it as well. But Europe is not like England is not dependent or non-independent. Like that's just a remarkably silly idea. And then to say that the United States would not be independent because the Soviet Union did that, it would be a remarkably silly idea. But anyway, highly industrial and technological European states are trying to elect a parliament, federal approach. And so this is like when I say the white woman marriage. That's an edifying example for us Africans. I'm even hoping that the European states succeed and thus show the way to Africa, considering that the African leaderships tend to ape European initiatives. Since Africa is so prone to imitating Europe for the better or the worse, that's one initiative we can start imitating as of now. For once, it would be a positive imitation. Even Europe is showing the way and attesting to the fact that the 19th century mini-states have become an anachronism in our epoch. A great political future is in store for Europe because all European problems are being seen by European leadership as continental European problems. But again, you see that the European Union has already failed, and you have the UK, which voted out itself, like I think last year or something, Brexit or something like that. And of course, Europe is now mishandling the COVID crisis, like huge. But let's go. Why is it any different for Africa? Why should the underdeveloped mini-states be valid for Africa when the superdeveloped mini-states are invalid for Europe? Only the blindest form of selfishness could restrict the vision of African leaderships to the confines of their mini-states. Even a lucid selfishness would dictate that the continental solution is the only one. Only this can prevent the voice of Africa from merely being an echo of some other state or bloc. But again, you don't need it to be a continental state. It could simply be a large state, a super state. You know, it doesn't have to be a continental state, just a super state, really. Culture, negritude, and the African personality. So, what is the actual mission of culture? Survival and creativity. Man must create to survive. To create, he must ensure his survival. Collective historical consciousness is one of man's chief means of survival and a source of creation. Destroy or stifle it, and the chances for the survival of a people become questionable. The cultural personality of Africa is inseparable from the restoration of our collective historical consciousness. Because most people are vaguely conscious of their local historical past, they end up flirting with their own past. Most of us are not even equipped to systematically refer to the Nile Valley for an understanding of either the present day or ancient structures of our society. Okay. Yet we can make very little headway in understanding our culture's language and social structures without a thorough knowledge of the many facets of ancient Egyptian civilization. Ancient Black Egypt was in every sense the actual cradle of our cultures. Without a systematic reference to Egypt, there can be no true cultural renaissance in Africa. After all, what is our objective if it is not that of recovering and promoting the creativity of our peoples? Man's mission is creation. African Renaissance, Black Renaissance, is inseparable from the restoration of the Black world's creativity. To assume his destiny, man must be a creator irrespective of his race. The loss of our national sovereignty strangled our independent creativity. Today, as black people are slowly recovering their national sovereignty, we are obliged to free ourselves from all forms of cultural alienation. Without that internal recovery and psychic self-appraisal, very little can be accomplished. So I'm going to actually take another screenshot. Okay, family, I like this one. Let's see if I'm going to trend, huh? Nah, it's going to be ignored. Hey, look, join my, come follow me on Twitter, okay? I'm going to be at Onitaset, at Onitaset. So follow me on Twitter, and you might see these screenshots. I mean, I'm taking a break from Twitter right now, but I should be ending my break soon. And when I do, I want to see you there, all right? Just let me know that you came through the thing. And also, I'm going to put this up on the Discord. I didn't take a break from the Discord. So come to the Discord and share what you think about this, all right? The recovery of political sovereignty is merely one aspect of the question. Economic sovereignty is another. Psychic autonomy is yet another. All three must combine in a dynamic, renovative effort. These are the terms by which I define the African and world Black Renaissance. So this is actually pretty interesting. So I actually got it from Leonard Jeffries. So Leonard Jeffries was saying that you have to go politics, economics, and culture. I am saying now you have to go so I say the same thing: politics, economics, and culture. I say they're all derivative of ethics, but outside of that, you see this recovery of political sovereignty, economic sovereignty, politics, economics, psychic is the culture, and again, if I were to go by what sciences these all corresponded to, because I think Leonard Jeffries also pointed this out: the three sciences, which is sociology, ecology, and psychology. See, psychic. And then I said that these three are ideology. Okay, so they all form from the idea the ideology. So this is why you want to have ideological training or ideological autonomy, and that would be from, like I said, I have 13 books I want you to read, but the main books is the Book of Power. Okay. Especially since I can tell if people are actually engaging that, and of course I know it like the back of my hand. I mean, that's new. No, I'm joking. All right, all three was combined into yeah. All right, the restoration of the historical consciousness of Black and African people, with all its implications, necessarily leads to a veritable reversal of perspectives and to fundamental transformations of our cultural relationship with the rest of the world. Black people have been weighed on the scale of history by others and been found wanting. Yet once we awaken to the historical realities through a scientific approach to history, we find that the very people who were considered to be historical debtors were actually the historical creditors. From ancient Egypt, from the oldest world civilization, came the scientific and technological knowledge, the religious ideas and cultural artistic contributions which shaped the earliest cultures of the European world. The day when Africans and Blacks in general will impose that point of view, a view supported by scientifically verifiable historical data, the self-image of Blacks and the warped image that others entertain about Blacks will have to undergo a most profound revision. It will mean that an entire vision of the universe will have to be changed. The hour is therefore approaching when other people will have to divest themselves, even against their conscious will, of the falsification and lies that have buried the original and unique contributions of the Black man to world history. To that end, we must work, fully equipped with the tools of science in every conceivable discipline. We should never lose sight of the fact that the restoration of the cultural personality of African and Black peoples in general can only be achieved through struggle. Many people attack negritude as a deceptive concept. Others defend it as a philosophy of African and Black rehabilitation. You are among its critics, yet all of your works deal with the historical, cultural, and social rehabilitation of the Black man. What then is your concept of negritude? I really wouldn't like to get into that. There are just too many emotional and conflicting issues involved. It would be too long to get into such a complex question. Precisely, this is why your comments on it are virtually important. It's an important issue. If we want to talk about negritude, the case of a man like Aimé Césaire must be treated all by itself. Césaire is an exceptional, literal genius. He is undoubtedly one of the greatest creative minds of the Black world. He is a man who lives his philosophy. He's a man truly committed to the cause of the Black world and to the progress of oppressed mankind. So, just to give you some context, Aimé Césaire, he writes about negritude, and I guess actually he gives you the context, but we don't really mention him too much in the West because I guess he's more on the francophone world. But like some people, like let's say if you study let's say Black history in a university, you probably come across Aimé Césaire. He's an unflinching anti-colonialist. Because of this, Césaire was practically the only one to have played a decisive and personal role in the mobilization of the Black students who were in France during the colonial period. He summoned all of ours to our feet in the struggle against the colonial oppressors. At political meetings, we were all captivated by Césaire, his clear thinking and lucid appraisal of the colonial question. Césaire was always physically present at our meetings alongside all those who were fighting colonialism. In fact, all of us used to talk about Césaire, his genius, his sincerity, and devotion to the Black and anti-colonial struggle. We weren't talking about negritude. Césaire was magnetic, vigorous, and poetic. Césaire created the term negritude, and at that time we devoured his works. So wow, so Diop was just engrossed with this man. This man was the eponymous, charismatic leader, if you will, or the charming leader, and this is something that you have to realize too, that part of leadership is that you are on display. It's you. It's about you. It's not so much about the ideas. It's about you as an individual. And eventually I'll come out of my shell. But essentially, yeah, you have to you have to work on that part of you, and that's what I one of the things inside of one of the things that the Book of Power is based off of is the Columbian Orator. And the Columbian Orator is this white book, okay? But it's a white book that got Frederick Douglass that inspired Frederick Douglass to become one of the greatest orators in American history. Okay, and he was a really magnetic speaker. Notwithstanding that he would, he's considered a biracial or whatever, but some people call him a bastard, right? But why I bring that up is to say that, in that book there was instructions on how to speak, and like you saw when I read Garvey to you, he also gives you instructions on how to speak. So what I do in the Book of Power is I also give instructions on how to speak, and I give it more so because I understand that, in our, like we say, we go back to ancient Kemet. He says ancient Egypt here, but ancient Kemet, there was a term called Medu Nefer, and that meant that you had good words. Okay, good words, and it didn't just mean that your words were good, but that you spoke well too. You were eloquent, you were magnetic. This was Cesare. You see what I'm saying? Like, it all comes back, and this is the thing that I want from you. Something that we don't even know is that Garvey was considered the best speaker of his time. Okay? Dessalines was also an excellent speaker. So I include Dessalines' speeches as well. And I give you these speeches to show you what excellent speech looks like. So this is important. This is all, it all comes back. There are lessons through everything. And this is why you read, so that you can understand the world around you. You can understand why Cesare was doing this. And it sounds like Diop was sitting right next to the dude. Negritude, as it became known, was originally a West Indian creation. Did not know that. Africans confiscated and monopolized it in post-colonial times. During the post-colonial epoch, an entirely different interpretation was given the term negritude. So I guess he's saying that the Indians, they consider themselves black or whatever, I don't know. Under the blanket term, a flood of literature emerged, the content of which was clearly deceptive. In fact, as far as I can remember, the term negritude was only applied to a literary or political current after Jean-Paul Sartre's Black Orpheus, written in 1948. Cesare coined the term, but prior to the publication of Sartre's book, I knew of no political or literary current which went under the name of negritude. This is an important element. Actually, what was done in the post-colonial epoch was to gather the political, anti-colonial black movements and writings of the 1930s and 40s and place them under the blanket term negritude. This was done only after and as a consequence of Jean-Paul Sartre's theorizations in Black Orpheus. To the 1940s, along with Cesare, there were men of the caliber of Leon Damas, who was also anti-colonialist. However, Damas's role was smaller than that of Cesare, who in fact dwarfed everyone else with his intense commitment and action against colonialism. At that time, there were other black intellectuals in Paris who were defending the colonial status quo with philosophical arguments. Their writings were indigestible to the mass of black students in Paris at that time. The difficulty today when invoking negritude resides in the fact that certain people use Cesare as a cover to fend off attacks from those who consider the post-colonial utilization of negritude as an obvious imposture. This is why all discussions on negritude must begin with a separate appraisal of Cesare, the man, the literary genius, the clairvoyant, political agitator, and determined anti-colonialist. All of us who knew Cesare during those years and who had continued to relate to him since then have an immense respect for his work, his integrity, and lasting contribution to the emancipation of black people. Cesare cannot be associated with anything other than the struggle against colonialism and the emancipation of black people. When I talk about Cesare, I don't talk about negritude. I talk about Cesare, the man I knew and respected, the genius, the fighter. Through his actions and work, Cesare exercised a personal influence on all those who came into contact with him. He continues to do so today over the younger generation. So, I mean, just to make it clear what it's about, negritude, it looks like the colonial apparatus used this term to put in subversive materials, right, or even pro status quo materials under the heading of negritude, when it really wasn't. Like negritude might have been Cesare's term. It'd be like this. Like, I use the word oncopia, right? Now, say in the future they include a bunch of these losers in the term oncopia, right? Then you might say, oh no, I mean, I liked Oni, right? You might be like, oh, I don't like what Diop is doing. He's saying, I don't really like the term oncopia anymore, because all these losers were already put into it. But I love Oni. You see what I'm saying? So that's really like what it looks like here. It's like they kind of subverted the term, and so he's saying, hey, it's kind of deceptive because you want to associate it with Césaire, but they obviously made it a blanket term for other things, and when realistically speaking, you just want to focus on this man, and you gotta understand this, that a lot of people are captivated by good leaders, and this is why I wanted you to be the good leader. But if you know, I guess the time has come for me to step forward, huh? If you don't want to, you know. But let's go. Césaire showed where there was a definite cultural alienation among blacks, more pronounced in the West Indies than in Africa, which required. Oh wait, let me see this. All right, whoa. Césaire showed that where there was a definite cultural alienation among blacks, more pronounced in the West Indies than in Africa, which required special attention in the struggle against colonialism. His aim, therefore, was to recover the lost cultural personality of colonized black societies. He attempted this through poetry, hence he extolled the psychic factor as a necessary component of a new African cultural personality and national consciousness. Let's say he rediscovered or introduced the psychic and cultural factor into the struggle of black people to regain their national sovereignty usurped by colonialism. Let me just check how much time I have. Ooh, I'm running slow, huh? Alright. Césaire thus wrote about how the black world lives, feels, and suffers. He attached importance to the differential psychology of Africans, blacks as opposed to Europeans. The poetry of Césaire, his literary creation, centered on the convulsions of the black soul when subjected to the oppressive conditions of colonialism. Militant action was attached to the new form of poetry among black intellectuals. Césaire's poetry was definitely not an abstract literary effort, but was rooted in the suffering of Africans, blacks. In a famous line in its extremely sensitive, beautiful, violent Cacher d'un rotor à pars notar, Césaire wrote, "My negritude is not a rock, its deafness hurled against the clamor of the day. My negritude is not a film of dead water on the dead eye of the earth. My negritude is neither a tower nor a cathedral. It plunges into the red flesh of the sun. It plunges into the burning flesh of the sky. It pierces the opaque prostration by its upright patience." Published in 1947, these lines were the words of a profoundly committed militant. The man who wrote those lines was loved, respected, revered by all who dreamt of freedom and independence and were working towards that goal. Jacques Rabé Manjara of Madagascar, Leon Damas of Guyana, and many others were among them. They all spoke and wrote in moving terms about the black soul and the suffering of black people. There were many West Indians among them. These militant intellectuals, Africans or West Indians, were therefore talking, writing, and acting within the context of an anti-colonial struggle. We weren't talking then about negritude. I want to say this too. This is you could tell Diop was inspired, and see Diop becomes this amazing individual. So this is why you share literature, you share poetry, you share the best of our past, because you want our people to be like, this is a genius himself, right? Diop is a genius who saw a genius and awakened and committed himself to that same cause. This is why you share genius. You know, a lot of people do not think that, oh, well, you shouldn't share any. No, you share genius. I think back to when I was younger and I saw "If We Must Die." You know, I could still recite it. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in this inglorious spot, while round this spot. You understand? Like, you have to. And I published that in the Pro-Black Compendium. I published it in the Pro-Black Compendium because I realized, look, you have to see genius. Okay? In other words, your scientific researches were spurred by the existence of a colonial order and by the cultural and psychic disorders analyzed by Frantz Fanon. That's correct. But the motivation wasn't called negritude then. When I started writing Black Nations and Cultures, I approached the problem of black subjugation from a different perspective than the literary anti-colonialists of the 1940s. Not being a poet nor a literary man, I did not approach it from the psychic angle, which had made Césaire's poetry such an irresistible and cutting weapon in the weakening of an African anti-colonial consciousness. I realized that the cultural personality of a people, of any people, was made up of three interrelated factors: the psychic factor, the linguistic factor, the historical factor. Hold on a second. Cultural personality is these three. I didn't invent that notion. Others had outlined it before. I merely saw it to be a fact. Hence, my efforts were geared towards the restoration of the linguistic and historical personality of black Africans. The poets of what was later called negritude had emphasized the psychic element, which is undoubtedly one of the components of the cultural personality of a people. I understood my scientific researches at a time when the prevalent and accepting data concerning the historical past of black societies was a misleading one. My cultural approach was scientific rather than poetic. Once on scientific terrain, I had only objective phenomena to analyze. I realized that out of the three components of the cultural identity of a people, only two could be apprehended scientifically: the linguistic and the historical factors. I therefore labored towards restoring the historical and linguistic personality of black people. I also worked towards the restoration of our common historical past by attaching primordial significance to the oldest and most accomplished civilization elaborated by black African people, ancient Egypt. So again, I also worked toward the restoration of our common historical past by attaching primordial significance to the oldest and most accomplished civilization elaborated by black African people, ancient Egypt. So I wouldn't say it's the oldest, I wouldn't say it's the most accomplished, but it is an old and accomplished civilization. Once I had realized that the collective personality, the cultural identity of a people, centered on three components: linguistic, historic, and psychic, I concentrated my scientific efforts along the two lines which could be grasped objectively by scientific research. That has been my approach to the cultural rehabilitation of the black man and of black societies. So, Africa. The difference, then, in your approach to the rehabilitation of the black man and that of the negritude poets of the 1940s is in your emphasis on sociology, linguistics, and history? Exactly. By describing the political and social structures inherited from our common historical past and which reflect the conditions in which our ancestors live, I was able to make a contribution to our rehabilitation. I was not, however, describing any sort of permanent state in man, since human beings are conditioned by their social and physical environment. Once you change the social environment, even a black man who has been conditioned by a communitarian lifestyle can become the most individualistic and self-centered being. Consequently, my work in history, sociology, and linguistics kept to the path of objective, verifiable reality. My throwing light on the falsifications to which the historical past of the black man has been subjected. These historical, sociological, and linguistic studies serve to reinforce the cultural personality of Africans. The cultural renaissance of our people is inconceivable outside of the restoration of both our historical past and our languages to a privileged position as the vehicles of modern education, technology, science, and the creative sensibility of our people. As long as the historical path linking us to our ancestors is not understood, critically appraised, legitimized, we will be unable to build a new future. To this end, the retrieval of our national languages is foremost. A systematic policy in favor of their growth, the inclusion of a modern technological and scientific lexicon, can no longer be excluded. The path which leads us to our ancestors and which led our ancestors to us cannot be understood without a systematic reference to ancient Egyptian civilization. In fact, it is impossible to elaborate a new body of social studies without a systematic reference to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt plays for Africa and blacks in general the same role which Greco-Latin culture plays for the Western world. From the outset, my researches were centered on ancient Egypt, its culture, language, religion, and science. I demonstrated the profound links binding the ancient Egyptians to modern black Africans, not only racially and culturally, but also linguistically. So again, this is something that you like to, this is a screenshot that you just want to grab in case, somebody calls you a hotep. Like I said, I'm a peaceful person, you know that. But, I like this. I like this. Are you enjoying yourself? We're close to an end. Are you like, oh no, it's ending soon? Are you like, come on, dude, let me just get back to reading. All right, I'll get back to reading. As a literary current, would you say that negritude has neglected the objective basis of society in favor of the purely subjective world? That's certainly so in the case of post-colonial negritude. In fact, I see a total incompatibility between the formal defense of African culture on the one hand and the systematic refusal on the other to adopt concrete measures to develop our national languages. Those who are incapable of solving this problem can do nothing for African culture. They merely embrace African culture to better smother it. Their attitude shows them to be imposters. Take a country like Senegal, for example, where 95% of the population speaks Wolof. How can one understand the fact that some people are panic-stricken when the adoption of Wolof is proposed as the official national language? If the Senegalese people can't be helped to retrieve and develop their linguistic unity now, what use is there to talk about defending African culture? In contrast to this, the attitude of someone like Julius Nyerere is consequential. Without rhetoric or fanfare, he elevated Swahili to the status of a national and governmental language. Come on. Okay, I guess you don't really know anybody to clap at books, but that's what, again, you want to raise up these examples. Julius Nyerere is slept on. He's slept on. What that means in American lingo is we're not paying attention. Like, we don't big him up enough. We big up a lot of people. We don't big up one of the people who elevated an African language to national and governmental status without any fanfare or rhetoric. None of that. We need to. None of that. And that's beautiful. That is beautiful. We have to. Ashe. I said Julius Nyerere. What do you say? Ashe. Julius Nyerere. All right. Flight from one's own language is the quickest shortcut to cultural alienation. For Africa, this has been a monumental problem, but it has to be tackled head-on. I have attempted to do this in my works, and my most thorough contribution on this subject will soon be available: the genetic kinship of Pharaonic Egyptian and African languages. Too often we talk about culture without grabbing the cow by the horns, as the saying goes. Why? Simply because we are contented with compromises that avoid the adoption of a radical stance in face of cultural problems. Few of us dare go to the roots of the problem via a scientific approach. This is what I do in my book, okay? I do a scientific approach. I'm not afraid. As a result, many of those who talk about promoting our national languages limit their intent to the domain of folklore. When they want to deal with serious questions, they turn to the languages of Europe. Kwame Nkrumah had opposed his concept of African personality to the concept of negritude. Are both concepts antithetical, or do they converge anywhere? They converge in the sense that both deal in generalities. We must get down to the facts, to the objective, apprehendable realities. When we talk about personality, meaning the personality of collective groups, we can only mean a cultural personality. And what is the basis of the cultural personality of a people, African or otherwise, if not a historical, psychic, and linguistic self-consciousness? These three elements are the constituent elements of a people's cultural personalities or identity. They are not static factors, but factors conditioned by humanity's social and physical environments. You have already seen my own approach to the problem of restoring the historical foundation of African cultures through scientific research in the field of history and linguistics. Moreover, you can also see where that approach has also clarified what is called the particular sensibility of the black person or black soul. I have tried determining the nature of the black particularity in history and to ascertain the way in which the black soul or black sensibility has influenced the material existence and creativity of black people by using the structures evolved by ancient black societies as a basis. Consequently, I analyzed family structures, clanic and tribal organizations, and finally the territorial state. These structures are the objective reflection of precise historical conditions and also of what is called the black soul. So my approach to the black soul has been through history, linguistics, and the material structures of ancient black societies. Rather than deal in generalities, we must know what the black soul is because it is our soul. The way I saw it at the beginning was that Africa's soul has been stolen and can only be retrieved through a scientific approach. In synthesis, we cannot oppose African personality to negritude, since both deal with only one of three components determining the cultural identity of a people. People live their culture. The roots of their culture are inseparable from their linguistic structure and historical past. That's the way I approach the question of culture. So about Carlos Mora, he was born in Cuba in 1942. Dr. Carlos Mora completed his doctoral and postdoctoral studies in ethnology at the University of Paris, France, in Europe, obviously. From 1975 to 1980, Moore lived in Dakar, Senegal, assisting Cheikh A Diop and acting as his personal interpreter. A resident of Guadeloupe, he is currently visiting professor at Florida International University. In February 1987, he convened the first conference on negritude, ethnicity, and Afro-cultures in the Americas, in homage to Aimé Césaire. So 1987, so this was probably published a pretty long time. But there you have it, everybody. And this was like $8 at African World Press once upon a time, right? Imagine that. But I mean, it's a good book. There you have it, okay? I hope you enjoyed my reading of this. I tried to read this a little bit more flavorful, so try to get this, like try to share this with other people. If you can get the Book of Power, get the Book of Power. You'll see that it has a lot of these solutions, a lot of this stuff that Cheikh A Diop discusses, like it addresses already. All right, it's for that. I enjoyed reading this. I think it's a really good book. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to probably try to download this, play it on the television. That's what I do with my son. Okay, I download my videos, or other videos, obviously, like Akili and that kind of stuff, children videos too. But I download my videos and I put it on the computer. You'd be surprised. My son is now, singing along, change the leader and lead the changes. You know what I mean? So, bless him, obviously. Obviously I don't say no G bless. I'm on. You know what I mean? But yeah, thank you for being a supporter. I'm thinking about starting an organization to promote the literature. So definitely come through the Discord and just contact me whenever and about whatever. Whatever questions on your mind, just get at me and I got you. Okay? Even if you want to ask me, who looks better between this person and that person, just ask me. I don't care. Anything you want, I got you. All right? But until we meet again, I'll think about what other book I can read. But until we meet again, Shem Yem Hotep and Anku Jas and Dem Neb. Amen. Amen. Amon Ma'at. Dua Necha. Right? All right. Thank you, family. Love.